A poor farmer spent his last $3 to save her from the bidding platform. $3 bills, that was what I had left of the winter. Not $3 and something. 3 even, folded once and tucked behind the tin cup on the shelf above the stove, which is where I kept what little I kept, because the shelf was too low to reach without bending down, and bending down reminded me every morning that I was still alive, still standing, still here on this 40 acres that the bank wanted back and the ground wanted to swallow. I'd worked out over the winter that a man in my position has a certain kind of pride available to him that costs nothing and provides nothing. I was acquainted with that pride. I had kept myself warm with it through December and January and part of February, when the truth of the thing finally got through the cold, and the pride both and I sold the second mule. The first mule had died on me in January. I'd had him 11 years. His name was Cass, and he had a way of leaning into a harness that you'd have to see to understand, not fighting it and not surrendering to it, just applying himself to it with a steady kind of intention that made the work go. I'd bought him when I was still farming the land beside Delia's father, before we married and the farm came to us, and he'd pulled through 3 seasons of real drought and 1 flood, and never once gave me a reason to doubt him. He died on a Thursday. The ground was too hard to bury him properly, so I did what I could, and I didn't think about it any more than necessary. Because there are things you lose that you can think about, and there are things you lose that you can't, and Cass was the second kind. The second mule I sold in February, because without Cass he was half a team, and half a team isn't worth the feed. So by March I had $3 bills and 40 acres of iron-cold ground, and a barn with nothing in it, and a roof with a soft corner over the west side of the house that I'd been telling myself I'd get to. The chickens had been down to 1 surviving hen by February, the rest taken by a fox I'd never managed to catch, and that 1 hen had made it through by being meaner than I deserved. The bank note was due in April. Not due as in I had a choice about it. Due as in the man from Harlan Savings would ride out, and we'd have a conversation I'd already had twice before, and both previous times I'd managed to find something, a piece of equipment sold, a neighbor's harvest worked, once a small inheritance from Delia's aunt that we'd both been too proud to ask about until we'd had to. But Delia was 6 years gone, and her aunt had gone the year after, and I'd sold what I had to sell and worked what I had to work, and I was 53 years old and I was out of things. That was the situation on the morning I pulled the 3 bills off the shelf and walked to town. I told myself I was going for the mail. I told myself I'd stop at Hendrick's Dry Goods and see if there was fence mending work, though I knew there wasn't. Hendrick's fences were fine. I'd ridden past them enough times to know. But asking was something to do with a morning, and a man who has run out of things to sell still has mornings. I walked the 3 miles into Cutter's Flat. The mud on the main road had the good smell it gets when the thaw finally takes hold below the surface crust, working its way up through the iron cold from underneath, and the birds had come back in the night the way they do when they feel something change in the air before you can feel it yourself. A hawk riding something invisible over the east ridge. The sun thin but present. My wife Delia had been the one who noticed those things. I'd been a man who walked with his eyes on the ground, watching for soft spots in prairie dog holes and whatever a field was doing, and she had spent years pointing out hawks and the particular colors in thunderstorm light and the way the cottonwoods went silver before the wind arrived. She said I walked through the world like I was looking for what was wrong with it. She wasn't far off. After she died, I started looking up some. Felt like I owed her that. I was looking up at the hawk when I heard the noise from behind the feed barn. Auctions in Cutter's Flat ran twice a month, 1st and 3rd Tuesdays, and Harlan Creed ran them the way he ran everything, with his clerk's handwriting in his ledger and his train whistle voice carrying over whoever else was talking, and with no particular feelings about what he sold as long as the bidding stayed honest and his percentage came out. Usually it was livestock, seized equipment, maybe land gone to back taxes. I bought a harrow at one of his auctions 2 years prior and paid him and carried the harrow home, and that was the extent of our relationship. What I walked into behind the feed barn was different. 20 men, maybe a few more, standing in a rough semicircle in the mud. I knew some of them. Obie Sturch from the hardware, who was a decent man. The Pratt brothers from the North Range, who were not. A man named Foskett who had come up from somewhere south and operated what the polite people in town called an informal lending business, and what the impolite people called what it actually was, a way of getting men into debt and keeping them there. He had a lawyer he brought up from the county seat, and the sheriff had never quite found the evidence he was looking for, so Foskett stayed. Maybe a dozen others, ranch hands, a man I was fairly sure had come in on the morning stage. Harlan stood on the wagon bed with his ledger. In front of the wagon, not on it, standing in the mud, was a woman I'd never seen before. She was maybe 30 years old, dark hair pinned up under a bonnet that had been pressed sometime and traveled since. Her dress was plain and had been good once. She had a trunk at her feet, the small kind that holds what you couldn't leave behind, which is usually not as much as you wish. She was not looking at the men in front of her. She was looking at a point somewhere beyond them, out past the crowd and the barn and the edge of town, the way a person looks when they have decided that what is happening to their body does not also get to happen to their face. I stood at the back of the crowd and listened to Harlan explain. She had come from St. Louis, Harlan said, on a contractual arrangement with a man named Aldrin Polk, who had since died consumption, January, before she'd even left Missouri, and his estate, meaning his brother Clem Polk, had refused to honor any part of the arrangement or provide passage back to St. Louis. She had signed a labor contract as part of the original agreement, which Clem Polk's lawyer argued she still owed, and Clem Polk had decided to sell the contract rather than enforce it himself, and here they were. Here they were. The bidding started at $1. I want to be honest about what happened inside me when Harlan said that, because I've thought about it enough since to be accurate. It wasn't righteous. It wasn't particular either. I'm not a man who acts on what's inside him most of the time. 30 years of farming teaches you that feeling a thing and doing something about a thing are two separate decisions, and the first one doesn't always earn the second. But I had stood in the mud of that yard and watched that woman look past the crowd, and I had seen the Pratt brothers leaning together laughing about something, and I had looked at Foskett with his ledger man's face, going through what the contract was worth to him, and something in me that had been patient for a long time ran out of patience. 2 bids had been called, 1 1/4 and 150 before I said 275. People turned to look at me. The Pratt brothers looked at me the way they looked at anything that inconvenienced them. Harlan looked at me with his professional expression, which was no expression at all. The ranch hand who'd been bidding, I didn't know his name. One of the Pratt brothers' men, I thought, rubbed the back of his neck. He said $3. I said $3.50. He said $4. I had $3. I looked at him. I looked at the Pratt brothers who were watching. Then I said $5. The ranch hand looked at the Pratt brothers. Something passed between them that I couldn't read from where I stood. Then the ranch hand shook his head and walked away from the bidding. Harlan called it 3 times. She hadn't looked at the crowd the whole time, not once. After the 3rd call, I walked to the wagon, and Harlan brought me the contract paper and his ledger. And I stood there with the knowledge of what I'd just done settling over me like a thing that's fallen before you can get out from under it. I had said $5 and I had 3. I had to figure something out about that, and quickly and quietly. I waited until Harlan stepped down from the wagon, and I pulled him aside and told him I needed to square the difference by Thursday. And Harlan, who was a practical man and not a cruel one, looked at me for a moment and then made a note in the margin of his ledger and said he'd hold it until Thursday noon. He said it like he was making an exception, which he probably was. I thanked him and he nodded and walked off toward the next piece of business, and I gave him my $3 and turned around. The woman was standing behind me. Up close she was tired in the way people get when they've been tired for long enough that they've stopped expecting to stop being tired. Her eyes were brown, steadier than they had any right to be, given the morning she'd had. She said, "I don't know what your intentions are, mister." I said, "Katie, Eli Katie, I farm out past the ridge." She said, "I don't know what you want from me, Mr. Katie." I thought about the fact that I owed Harlan Creed $2 more by Thursday noon, and I had no idea how I was going to get them. I said, "Ma'am, I'd be lying if I said I had it all worked out. What I'd appreciate is if you tell me your name so I can stop thinking of you as the woman from the auction." She said, "Nora Vess." I picked up the smaller handle of her trunk and she took the other, and we walked out from behind the feed barn. The men who were still there watched us go. I didn't look at them. She didn't either. On the main street, I set her trunk down and I said, "I need to stop at the hardware for a minute." She said, "All right." She waited outside. I went in and found Obie Sturch behind his counter and asked him if he had $2 of work that needed doing by Thursday. Obie looked at me over the counter and then looked past me at the woman standing outside his window and then looked back at me. He said, "I've got some inventory to count and shelve that's been sitting since November." I said, "I'll be here tomorrow at first light." He said, $2 is $2, Eli." I said, "I know it is." We shook on it and I went back outside and picked up the smaller handle of the trunk and told Nora the farm was 3 miles out and asked if she'd rather ride. She said, "I've walked further." We walked. The morning had gone gray by the time we left the main road and turned north toward the ridge. The clouds that had been on the western horizon when I'd come into town had moved in while I was behind the feed barn, which was the kind of thing weather does when you're occupied with something else. Not threatening, just there. She carried the larger handle of the trunk and I carried the smaller, and between us we made reasonable time. The trunk wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. She didn't ask to rest. I didn't offer to take her side. The first mile she didn't say much. Neither did I. The mud road ran west and then turned north toward the ridge, and I knew every tree along it and the sound of it under boots in different weathers. And this was the first time I'd walked it with another person since Delia and I used to walk it sometimes in the evenings when the work was done and there was still light left. She walked like she was used to distances. Not fast, but steady, the kind of steady that means you've stopped thinking about how far it is. Part way through the second mile she said, "The contract." I said, "Yes." She said, "The piece of paper Harlan Creed has, that's Clem Polk's property. Not yours. Whatever you paid for, it doesn't obligate me to you." I said, "I know." She said, "You paid for something with no legal claim on me." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Then why?" I said, "I paid so those other men wouldn't." She walked another 100 yards or so. The ridge was in front of us now, the pines dark against the gray sky. She said that was a foolish thing. I said, "Maybe. I've done foolish things with better money." She said, "How much did you have?" I told her, $3 and 2 more coming from Obie's inventory by Thursday. She was quiet for another long stretch. Then she said, "You bid more than you had." I said, "I did." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I looked at the man bidding against me, and I decided I'd rather owe money than lose that particular auction." She didn't say anything to that, but something changed in how she was walking. I can't put a name to it exactly. She was present in a way she maybe hadn't been before, like she'd been holding herself slightly outside of the moment, and now she let herself be in it. Like she'd been waiting to see what kind of thing she was walking alongside and had gotten enough of an answer to settle in. The farm looked the way it looked, which was not inspiring. The house stood, which was the first thing I always noticed when I came home from anywhere, that it was still standing. The roof had a soft corner on the west side I'd been meaning to get to since November. The barn was sound because I'd built it myself and knew every nail in it. The yard was mud and dead grass, and the surviving chicken, which came around the corner of the barn when we arrived and gave Nora the look it gave everything. Nora set down her end of the trunk and looked at all of it for a moment. She looked at the house and the barn and the yard and the field edge you could see past the fence line, which was last year's stubble poking through the mud. She said, "Do you have seed money?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Mule." I said, "Sold the second one in February." She said, "What do you have?" I said, "The land, the barn. The house has a good stove, a harrow I need to fix, and a tool shed with most of what should be in a tool shed." She nodded once, not agreeing with me. Filing the information. She said, "Can I see the house?" I showed her the house. She went through it the way you go through a place when you're trying to understand it rather than admire it. She opened the firebox on the stove and looked at the baffle and closed it. She opened the cabinet beside the dry sink and took inventory of what was in there: flour, 2 tins, some hard jerked meat, a jar of last year's preserved beans. She looked at the window over the table, which faced east and had the good morning light. She looked at the ceiling, particularly the west corner. She went out through the back and looked at the root cellar and came back. She said, "There's a half sack of oats down there." I said, "I know, I was saving them." She said, "For what?" I said I wasn't sure yet. She looked at me without any particular judgment in it, just the look of a person deciding what to do with a fact. She said, "What will you do about the bank note?" I said, "I have until April. There are some things I can try." She said, "There's a man named Gunder who runs the seed co-op in Cutter's Flat. He'll sometimes carry a crop loan for farmers he knows." I said, "How do you know about Gunder?" She said, "I spent 2 days in that town before the auction." I listened. I looked at her standing in my kitchen with her bonnet off now and her hair slightly escaped from where she'd pinned it, and I thought, she had arrived in a town where she was about to be auctioned off, and she had spent 2 days listening, paying attention to a situation she had every reason to just endure. I said, "I know Gunder." She said, "He'd carry you." I said, "I've been avoiding asking him." Pride. She said, "That's a luxury." I said, "I know it is." We didn't have a long discussion about sleeping arrangements. I showed her the back room, which had Delia's old cot in it, and I told her I'd sleep in the main room by the stove. She said that wasn't necessary. I said I slept light anyway, and the stove kept me regular about banking it through the night. She looked at me for a moment and said, "All right," and took her trunk into the back room. I banked the stove and lay down in the main room with my coat over me and listened to the house settle. It sounds different when there's more than one person in it. The creaking and the settling, which is just a house breathing in the cold, sounds like something particular when you know you're not alone in it. More like the life inside the building than just the building. I didn't sleep right away. Hadn't slept alone in 6 years, and then I had, and now I wasn't alone and I couldn't quite place the feeling. Not comfort exactly. More like the acknowledgement of a gap that had been there so long I'd stopped noticing it. In the morning she was at the stove before me. I heard the firebox open and the wood settle and the stove coming up from a banked fire, and then I smelled coffee. I hadn't had coffee in 3 weeks. I'd been rationing the grounds, stretching them, and then they'd run out and I'd told myself I didn't need it. That's the kind of thing you tell yourself when you're alone. She handed me a cup when I came through. She'd found the grounds in the back of a tin I'd forgotten. I didn't ask her how she'd known to look. She was a woman who looked in the backs of tins. We ate without much talking. She was looking at the east window, the light coming in gray and cold and early. I was looking at my hands around the cup. After a while she said, "How long have you been here?" I said 14 years on this farm, Before that, I farmed the land next to my wife's father's place. This came to us when we married. She said, "You said your wife." I said she passed 6 years ago. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "It's past now." She said, "It doesn't go past." I looked at her. She was still looking at the window. Her face in the morning light was not what you'd call beautiful in any way a stranger would stop and notice, but it was a face that had thought about things and not been wrong too often. And she said it the way you say something you know from the inside, not from observation. I said, "No, I suppose it doesn't." She poured me the last of the coffee. That morning she found a fence post along the south edge of the yard that had rotted through at the base. She didn't mention it to me. She found a sound post in the pile behind the barn and the post hole digger in the tool shed, and she replaced it. I saw her doing it when I came around the corner of the house with the harrow parts I'd been sorting, and I stopped and watched her for a moment and then went back to the harrow. In the afternoon she stood under the west corner of the roof and looked at it. She said, "You have tar paper." I said, "In the barn, left of the door." She said, "I can do it." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know I don't. Do you want the roof fixed?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then I'll fix it." She climbed up there with the tar paper and the tacks and fixed it while I was at the harrow, and when she came down, I didn't say thank you because she hadn't said it like she wanted thanks. She'd said it like she'd looked at a problem and wanted to fix it, same as I would have. We ate that evening from what the cabinet had, which in her hands became more than it was. She had a way of deciding what a thing needed and giving it exactly that, not more. The core of any good cooking, and a lot of other things besides. After dinner, I washed the dishes and she dried them, and I told her about Obie's inventory, and the $2 coming Thursday that would square the difference with Harlan. She said, "Good." I said, "I'll still need to figure out the bank note." She said, "One thing at a time." I said, "I've been saying that for 4 months." She said, "And the bank hasn't taken the farm yet." I said, "April's coming." She said, "April's coming either way. One thing at a time is still the right method." I put the last dish on the shelf. Outside the wind had picked up, which meant the cold was coming back for another argument, which it would lose eventually, but not before making its point. She said, "I want to see the north field tomorrow." I said, "It's just last year's stubble." She said, "I know what stubble looks like. I want to see the soil." The next morning she came with me to the north field. We walked out through the gate, and along the fence line where the mud was crusting at the top but still gave underfoot, and she looked at the field the way I'd been looking at it all winter, turning it over, thinking about what to put where and when, which was the kind of thinking that had kept me sane through the months when there was nothing else to do. She stopped at the edge of the plowed section and crouched down and picked up a handful of soil and turned it in her fingers and looked at it. She said, "How deep does the frost go on this end?" I said, 8-9 inches here. Deeper on the west side, it stays in shadow longer. She said, "So the east end comes out of the frost earlier." I said, "By 2 or 3 weeks some years." She said, "That's 2 or 3 weeks you could use. If you plant the east end last, you're not fighting the frost on the rest of the field while you wait." I'd been thinking about that field all winter, and I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been thinking about seed money and mules, which were both walls, and I'd been standing in front of the walls instead of thinking about what was on the other side of them. I said, "You grew up farming." She said, "My father did. I was the one who showed up." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean there was my father and there were 4 brothers and then there was me, and somebody had to actually pay attention to the work, and that was me. My brothers put in the labor. I thought about the farm." I said, "Where are they now?" She said, "Scattered. My father's still in Kansas, last I heard. He remarried about 3 years after my mother died, and his new wife had her own ideas about the arrangement, so I left. That was 4 years ago." She stood up and brushed the soil off her hands. She was looking out over the field. The wind had the cold edge to it still, but the sun was warm where it hit direct, and the light on the field was the particular light of early spring, too bright for winter and not warm enough for what comes after. I said in Aldrin Polk. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wrote well. He described the land and the work, and his letters seemed honest. He said it would be hard, didn't pretend otherwise, and I had run out of other situations to be in." I said, "What happened to him?" She said, "Got sick in September. Gone by January. Clem Polk wrote me a letter full of legal words, and I got on the stage anyway because I didn't have money for another season in St. Louis, and I thought maybe when I arrived it would be different than the letter said. It wasn't." She said it flat, not asking for anything from it. I said, "I'm sorry." She said it was a bad situation that got worse. Those exist. You deal with them. We walked the rest of the north field. I showed her where the soil ran thin over the caliche on the west edge, and where the drainage was good in the creek corner. She asked questions that told me what she already knew, the questions you only ask when you understand what the answers mean. On the way back she said, "You could borrow against the crop, seed money." I said, "I know a man at the co-op, Gunder. I've been avoiding going to him." She said, "Pride." I said, "Pride." She said, "Go tomorrow." I said I was planning to. She said, "Good." That evening, the second evening, she cooked with the onions from the root cellar and 2 wrinkled beets, and a heel of smoked ham she found at the back of the cold shelf where I'd missed it in October. What she made from those things tasted like a meal someone had intended, not just sustenance arranged into servings. I washed the dishes. She dried them. We'd fallen into that without discussing it. She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "All right." She set down the dish she was drying and looked at the shelf above the stove where the tin cup sat. She said, "I have $14, saved over 3 years in St. Louis. I carried it in my boot on the stage because I didn't want to put it anywhere Clem Polk could argue was his. It's mine. I'm not saying otherwise." I said, "Of course it is." She said, "But I want to say something about it, and I need you to hear what I'm actually saying, not what you might assume I'm saying." I said, "All right." She said, $14 doesn't easily get a woman from here back to St. Louis and into a different situation. It's possible, but it's uncertain and it takes time, and there's an aunt in Harmon I've been avoiding thinking about because going to Harmon feels like going backward. I said, "The Umber brothers run their freight wagon through Harmon every Thursday." She said, "I know, you mentioned it." I waited. She said, $14 and a woman who can work is a different thing than $14 alone. And 40 acres of ground and a man who knows what he's doing is a different thing than 40 acres with no money. If you put those 2 different things together, you get something that might actually work. I said, "That's a practical argument." She said, "It is." I'm making it on practical grounds because those are honest grounds, and I don't know you well enough yet to make it on other grounds. I said, "Yet." She said, "Yet." I was 53 years old. My wife had been gone 6 years, and I had spent those 6 years becoming a man who worked alone and would probably die working alone, and I had made my peace with it. Not accepted it, more like stopped fighting it. I had stopped expecting anything different. I said, "Nora, I'm 53. She said, "You keep saying that like it's an argument against something." I said, "It's a fact." She said, "So is the North Field and the $14 and the bank note in April. I'm trying to talk to you about what we do with the facts." I looked at the tin cup on the shelf, where the $3 had been before I went to town. I said I would want to do it properly, with a preacher, not because anyone's watching, because that's the kind of thing I believe in doing right. She said, "So do I." I said I'm not an easy man to live with. I go quiet for long stretches. I fix things and don't say anything about it. I get up at 4 in the morning. She said, Eli, I've been here 2 days, I know those things. I said, you can't know a man in 2 days. She said, I know some things in 2 days. I know you fixed the harrow yesterday and didn't say a word about it to me. I know you sleep light because I heard you at the stove in the middle of the night. I know you had $3 left in the world, and you spent them on a woman you'd never met because you couldn't watch what was happening and do nothing. I know your wife's been gone 6 years, and you still make the bed with both sides smooth. I hadn't known she'd noticed that. She said, I'm not going to Harmon. I'm telling you now so you can stop thinking about the Umber Brothers wagon. I said, Nora. She said, you don't have to decide anything tonight. I'm just telling you where I am. I went out to the barn that night. I didn't need to, but I needed to walk, and the barn was the right distance. I sat on the stool in Cass's old stall, which was empty and clean now, just the bare boards and the smell of horses that stays in wood a long time after the horse is gone. The cold was still serious at night. My breath fogged, and the boards at the outer wall had frost in the seams. I put my hands in my coat pockets and sat in the dark with just the thin bar of light from the house window showing under the barn door. I thought about the last 2 days the way you go over something when you know you might have missed something important. I was not a man who made quick decisions about serious things. I had bought that harrow at Harlan's auction and taken 2 weeks to decide whether it was the right harrow, which Delia had found maddening and which I had considered prudent. I had courted Delia for 8 months before I'd said anything about it, which she had also found maddening, and which I had considered appropriate given that she was the most important decision I expected to make in my life. 2 days was not 8 months. But I had also been the man who'd raised his hand in that auction yard and said $5 when I had 3, and I hadn't taken 2 weeks to decide that. I hadn't taken 2 seconds to decide it. I'd seen the Pratt brothers laughing, and I'd seen that woman looking at her horizon point, and something had just moved in me the way a thing moves when it knows where it's going. I thought about Delia the way I sometimes did when something was changing, not grief. Exactly, more like consulting her. She had known me better than I'd known myself most of the time, and I'd spent 6 years learning to make decisions without that, which was harder than the farming and lonelier. She would have said, Eli, you've already decided. You decided it behind the feed barn, and the question now is whether you're going to keep pretending you haven't. She would have been right about that. She usually was. I sat in the barn until the cold got into my hands through the coat pockets, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Then I went back inside. The lamp in the main room was out. The stove was banked properly. She'd banked it. I could tell by the particular way the heat was holding, not the fast hot burn of a new fire, but the steady even warmth of a fire that had been managed. She'd done it after I went out. I hadn't asked her to. I stood in the dark kitchen for a minute and listened to the house. Then I went to sleep. In the morning I came in early and she was at the stove and she handed me a cup without looking up, and I said, I'm going to Cutter's flat today. I need to finish Obie's inventory and get the $2, and then I'm going to see Gunder at the co-op. She looked up. I said, I've been avoiding asking him because I didn't want to ask a man for money. That was pride, and I'm done with it. She said, do you want me to come? I said no. If I'm going to ask for money, I'd rather do it without a witness. She said, that's fair. I said, I'll be back by dark. She said, I'll have something cooked. I pulled on my coat and hat, and I looked at her standing at my stove in my kitchen, and I went to town. Obie had me counting bolts and nails and sorting crates for most of the morning, which is the kind of work that leaves your mind free to go where it wants. I thought about what I was going to say to Gunder. I'd known him 14 years. He was deliberate, not sentimental, ran the co-op the same careful way he'd run it for 20 years, cautious in and cautious out, but not greedy. He helped farmers he believed in. The question was whether he still believed in me. Obie paid me $2 at noon, and I walked across to the co-op. Gunder was behind the counter. He had the look he got when a man came in to ask something rather than buy something. He could always tell the difference. He said, "Eli, haven't seen you in a while." I said, "No, I've been staying close to the farm." He said, "Heard you sold the mule." I said, "Both of them." He nodded and waited. I told him about the north field and the east end coming out of frost 2 weeks later, and what I could plant where, and he listened. I told him about the bank note. I laid out my plan for the south field and the creek corner and what the yield could be in a decent summer. I'd done the arithmetic all winter and I gave it to him straight. Then I said, "I need seed money. I'm asking you to carry it against the crop." Gunder was quiet. He picked up a pencil and wrote something in the margin of his ledger. He said, "You've been here 14 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "You ever missed a payment to me?" I said, "No." He said, "I know it, just saying it out loud so we both hear it." He wrote something else. He said, "I'll carry you to $30 against the harvest. That get you what you need for seed." I said, "And maybe toward a mule." He said, "You find a mule." I said, "I'm hoping to borrow from the Delacroix place for the spring turning." He said, "Pierre Delacroix has a matched gray pair. He'll lend them. His son-in-law farms north of you and Pierre's always looking for reasons to come out that way." I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "Ask him." We settled the terms and I signed his paper, and he gave me the credit note and said, "Finest transaction of the year, Eli." He said that about every transaction, and it never got less true from his side of it. On my way out I stopped. I said, "Gunder, you heard about the auction Tuesday?" He looked at me. He said, "I heard about it." I said, "Anything people are saying?" He said, "Some people saying things. Pratt brothers mostly. You know how the Pratt brothers are." I said, "I know." He said, "Obi Sturch is saying you did right, for whatever that's worth." I said, "It's worth something." He said, "It is. Obi's a straight man." I walked home in the afternoon light with $30 of co-op credit in my pocket and $2 in coin, and the banknote shifted from immediate to manageable, which is not the same as solved but a significant improvement. The ridge road was good in the afternoon. The mud had dried enough on the surface to walk without the sucking sound it made in the morning, and the shadows were long from the west and the air had the particular quality it gets in late March when the thaw is real, and not just a tease, a softness under the cold, something opening. I thought about Nora saying, "I didn't stay because I had nowhere to go." I thought about the $14 in her boot on the stage from St. Louis, and the 2 days she'd spent listening to a town before it auctioned her off. The fence post she'd replaced without telling me, the roof she'd fixed while I was at the harrow, the way she'd asked about the east end of the north field and the frost depth, and then just filed that information without commenting on the fact that I hadn't thought about it. A woman like that doesn't get put on a platform in Cutter's Flat. That's the plain fact of it. A woman like that doesn't end up in the mud in front of the Pratt brothers if things had gone differently in St. Louis or in Kansas or in any of the other places where they hadn't gone well. But things go how they go, and the world is full of women who should have been treated better than they were, and a man can either be one more way it goes wrong or he can do something else. I'd spent my $3. That's all I'd done. And somehow that had turned into Nora Vess banking my stove correctly and fixing my roof, and telling me she wasn't getting on the Umber Brothers wagon. I walked home. She had something on the stove when I came in. I sat down and took off my boots and told her about Gunder and the $30 and the Delacroix mules. She said, "When will you ask Pierre Delacroix?" I said, "Tomorrow, I'll ride over." She said, "I'll come. I want to see how they handle." I said, "You've handled mules." She said, "My father had 3. 2 were difficult and 1 was mean." I said, "Gunder says these are well trained." She said, "They can still be finicky with a new driver. It would help to have two people on the lines from the start. That was true, and she knew it was true before I confirmed it. We ate, and outside the cold settled back in for the night the way it would for another month at least, making its point. But the house held the warmth from the stove, and the lamp was lit, and there were two people at the table. After we ate, I said, I talked to Reverend Alcott today, while I was in town. She set down her fork. I said, I told him I had a question about a wedding ceremony. He said he'd be available when we needed him. She looked at me. I said, I want to do this right, not just the farm, you and me. I want it done properly with a preacher and witnesses and the word said. She said, Eli. I said, I know you came here for something different, and it didn't go the way it was supposed to. I know I'm not what you'd have chosen if you'd had more choices. She said, stop. I said, I'm trying to be honest. She said, you're talking yourself into a corner you don't need to be in. Stop. I stopped. She said, I didn't stay because I had nowhere to go. I have $14 and an aunt in Harmon, and I could have been on that wagon Thursday. I stayed because I looked at you, and I looked at this farm, and I decided. I said, in 2 days. She said, I decided in the first day. The second day I was making sure. I said, making sure of what? She said, that you were who I thought you were. I said, and? She stood up from the table and she crossed the room to where I was sitting, and she put her hand on my arm, just her hand on my forearm, plain and warm through the cloth of my shirt, and she looked at me. She said, Eli, I mean you, not a better version of you or a younger one, you. We were married in May. Reverend Alcott from Cutter's Flat. Obie Sturch stood witness because he was a decent man and I trusted him, and a woman named me from the rooming house stood with Nora. The words were said properly, signed and witnessed, the thing done right the way I believe in doing things. Reverend Alcott had a handshake like a vice, and he used it on me after, and said something about the Lord's provision that I didn't quite catch, but thanked him for anyway. Me cried, which surprised me, and didn't seem to surprise Nora at all. Afterward, Obie took us to dinner at the hotel in Cutter's Flat, which I hadn't eaten at in 7 years, and he ordered the good coffee and the good beef, and he said, Eli, I've known you since you came to this town, and I'm glad you did something foolish with your last $3. I told him it wasn't the last foolish thing I intended to do, and he said he was relieved to hear it. The Pratt brothers weren't there because they weren't invited. I heard later they had things to say about it, which was their right. I gave it the weight I give most things the Pratt brothers say, which is close to nothing. Foskett left Cutter's Flat the following winter for reasons the sheriff was cagey about, and nobody much missed him. The bank's lending man rode out to see me in April, the same man I'd been dealing with for 4 years, and I had Nora bring coffee and we sat at the table, and I showed him the co-op numbers and the planting schedule, and he looked at it the way he looked at things he couldn't find fault with. He shook my hand when he left. I noticed it was a different handshake than the ones before. Pierre Delacroix lent us the matched grays from the end of March through the end of April. He drove them over himself, which I hadn't expected. He was a tall, quiet man of maybe 60, with a French-Canadian way of talking that had softened some from however many years on the frontier. And he brought the grays in good condition with their lines freshly oiled and stood in my yard and shook my hand, and then Nora's hand. He said, the old one's name is Roy. The young one answers to Baptiste, but he's not particular about it. They don't like rain on the left side makes them shy. I don't know why. Otherwise they're good animals, and I'll be sorry if they come back in worse condition than they left. Nora said they won't. Pierre looked at her for a moment, and then nodded like he'd gotten what he needed from that. His name for the older one was Roy, and the younger one he called Baptiste, and they were as well trained as Gunder had said, even and willing on the lines. Not spooky, not mean. Nora drove Baptiste from the first day, and I drove Roy, and we turned the north field in 4 days. which was faster than I'd ever turned it even with my own 2 mules. She was better on the turns than me. She'd deny it if I said it to her face, but it was true. When Pierre came to collect them at the end of April, he walked around both animals and checked their hooves and ran his hand along their withers and looked at their teeth, and then he looked at Nora. He said, "You drove the young one." She said, "Yes." He said, "He's better than when he left. What did you do with him?" She said, "Talk to him mostly." Pierre thought about that. He said, "I've tried that. He doesn't usually listen." She said, "You have to mean it." Pierre looked at me and then back at her, and then he laughed, which I hadn't heard him do before in the handful of times I'd dealt with him. He said, "Eli, this one's worth more than a matched pair of mules." I said, "I know it." He drove them home and came back 2 weeks later with his son-in-law to look at the creek corner fencing, which gave me the chance to show him the planting and the layout of the fields, and he walked the north field the way Nora had walked it in March, crouching down and taking soil in his fingers, and when he stood up he said, "Good ground. You're not wasting it." We planted the north field in 2 passes with the hand seeder, Nora going one direction and me the other, and by May the rows were showing green. Regular and where they were supposed to be. Not spectacular. Nothing about farming is spectacular, which is something people who don't farm don't understand, and once you do understand it you realize it's one of the things that makes it worth doing. The regularity of it. The rows where you put them. The bank note we paid in June, and I sent Nora with the bank draft because I didn't trust myself to hand it to that man without saying something I'd been saving for 4 years. She came home and told me it was done. I said, "How'd he take it?" She said he was polite. I said, "He's always polite. It's what I can't stand about him." She said he asked who I was. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I was Eli Katie's wife, and I was there to pay the note." She said it the same way she said everything, plain and direct, not asking for anything from it. But I was standing in the kitchen hearing it, and something in me that had been clenched since April of the year before, since 4 years before, since 6 years of holding things together alone, just let go. Eli Katie's wife, said to the bank man without any hesitation at all. I put my hand on the back of her chair, and she looked up at me, and I said, "Thank you, Nora." She said, "It was the bank note, Eli. It needed paying." I said, "I know, thank you anyway." By October the harvest was in, and the root cellar was full in a way it hadn't been in years. The north field had done what I'd hoped, and a little more the east end came out of the frost when Nora said it would, and I'd had the seed in the ground 2 weeks before I could have managed it the old way, and those 2 weeks showed. I'd bought back from the Delacroix place the older of their 2 grays. Pierre called him Roy, but the mule didn't care what I called him as long as I fed him on time, so I named him Nothing, and we got along fine. I had gone back to Gunder in August to start paying down the seed loan. He'd looked at the payment and made a note and said, "North field came in good." I said it did. He said, "Who told you about the frost timing?" I said, "My wife." He looked at me over the counter. He said, "Eli, I've known you 14 years. You never thought about frost timing." I said, "I know." He said, "You're a lucky man." I said, "I know that too." He said, "Finest transaction of the year, the one you made in March." He meant Nora, not the seed loan. I understood that. I paid the loan down by September and cleared it in full before the harvest was finished. Gunder made a note in his ledger, and I signed beside it, and we shook hands, and I walked home and told Nora, and she said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing, which was mending a piece of tack that had been in the tool shed broken for 2 years. She had a gift for finding the things I'd been living around for so long I'd stopped seeing them. I was at the south fence one afternoon, last of the season's fencing before the cold came back for keeps, when I looked up and saw Nora coming across the yard from the house. She'd been at something since midday. She had a habit of starting a project without telling me and finishing it before she said anything, which was a habit I recognized as my own, and which I found, as it turned out, unexpectedly fine in someone else. She came across the yard with a cup of water because she'd seen from the window that I was at the fence. She handed it to me and stood beside me, and I drank it. She said, "The canning's done." I said, "All of it." She said, "All of it." I counted. "We're good through winter." I finished the last staple and dropped the hammer in the grass and stood up straight. The afternoon light was the thin gold October makes in this part of the country, the kind that lies flat on everything and makes the ordinary look like something you chose. The cut stubble of the north field pale in it. The sky that particular blue it only does in fall, and only for a few weeks. She stood beside me and looked out over the field. I looked at her, looking at it. She said, "It's a good farm." I said, "It is." She said, "You just needed a good year." I said, "I needed a few things." She turned and looked at me, the full look, the direct one. She put her hand on my arm, same as the morning in March in the kitchen. Same hand, same warmth, same place on my sleeve, like she'd found where it belonged and knew it. I put my hand over hers. 53 years old. A woman who had come from St. Louis on a stage and ended up in the mud behind a feed barn and walked 3 miles home with a man who had spent his last $3 and more, technically, dollars he didn't have to get her out of that mud. Who had decided in the first day and made sure in the second. The field was cut. The root cellar was full. Roy was eating at the paddock fence without complaint, which from a mule is the highest available praise. The roof was sound in every corner. The stove would do the winter. I was a man at the end of a good day on his own land with a good woman beside him, and his name said at the bank, without hesitation, by the only person he'd ever want saying it. That was the whole of it. More than I'd been given, more than I'd expected. Exactly the right amount. We stood at the fence and watched the light go off the hills.